Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
This is true, although you will scream otherwise. And original. It's difficult to describe everything that happened properly, but I will try. Back in the late 1980s, my family was having it tough like a lot of other families at the time. My family had lived all around 2 states, trying to make ends meet, living in all sorts of types of places, but always of the lower income area sort. Finally, my mother put her foot down. She was sick of renting houses and she wanted one of her own. So they ended up buying the cheapest place they could find. It was this house in one of those regional areas that has all the worst characteristics of the city and the country, with none of the good points of either. The town was a low-income, isolated shithole kind of place. You could hear the banjos playing when you drove in, and the people there would tell us to our face that they didn't like blow-ins around here. Even on a street full of shitty houses, our house stood out as the worst, but it was the best my parents could afford, and almost immediately, they started a 10-year scavenging odyssey for every scrap of timber they could find to do it up. The former owners, the people who had built the place, were strange, but we didn't realize the extent of it for a while. I was just a little kid at the time, and all I knew was that the house frightened me. As soon as you walked in, you could feel the house hating you. It radiated a low-grade, grimy sort of malevolence from the very timbers. It had been thrown together from bits of scrap taken from the dump, even to the point that old bits of fence post had been used as beams and even hammered into place with rusty second-hand nails. It creaked at night because nothing was fastened properly, not even the roof. When the summer westerlies came through, it would flap until it seemed it would come off entirely. The house creaked, and when it creaked, it cursed us. When my parents could finally afford to hire an electrician to look at the wiring, he was horrified and mystified, both at the fact that the place hadn't burned down yet, and that at least 2 rooms had impossible circuits. They should not have worked, but did anyway. There was not a straight line to be found in the place. You could see daylight through the gaps between the floorboards and where the ceiling joined the wall. The place was a dump, and it hated everyone who walked in, and the people living in it in particular. The former owners were not very clean and had left a lot of rubbish behind. My family was poor but clean, and my parents refused to live with anyone else's junk and immediately set to work with cleaning products and bin liners. We found some things. We felt that all of the house hated us, but the hate was worst in one of the back bedrooms. I couldn't walk in there without shaking. Most of my memories in that house are of being afraid. It was many years before my parents told me what they'd found in there. The first thing of note was an Ouija board. My family is not religious, but my parents are quietly spiritual. Not the candle-burning, angel card, aromatherapy type of spiritual, but the type of spiritual that means respecting the feelings that you get around certain places, and the belief in a general cosmic karma. They regard Ouija boards as things that bring a lot of trouble into the world. The dead are dead, and sometimes they stay with you for a time, but if you deliberately open doors, bad things come through. The second thing they found in that room was a black pentagram painted on the ceiling, and the third was a painting of a man. The Ouija board was thrown away immediately, and Dad found some paint and a ladder and climbed up to paint over the pentagram. Every step up on the ladder frightened him because he knew he was going to fall, and my father was a tall, strong man with excellent balance. He had to call my brother in to hold the ladder because he couldn't stop shaking. It took him 2 hours to paint over that pentagram. 2 hours to slap a bit of paint on a small area, and with every brush stroke he could feel the house hating him and fighting him. It was like moving through water. Every limb was heavy, every gesture dull and clumsy. When he finished, he climbed down and sat and shook with the effort of fighting. The house wanted the pentagram, that cliched bit of rubbish, to stay, and it was angry that it was gone. The fight, though, wasn't over because there was still the portrait of the man left. I didn't see the portrait myself. I was left with friends during the week or 2 it took my family to move in. I was little, so I would have gotten in the way. I'm told that it was not done with any particular skill, nor with any particular lack of talent. The man was neither handsome nor ugly, but he smiled, and he wanted to stay. At first, my parents and my brothers were merely discomforted by the painting. It worried them, but they couldn't say why. It was thoroughly unremarkable. But it seemed like it had this pull, this influence, and they quickly realized that they couldn't even be in the same room with it. It was both fascinating and terrifying, and my father said, "Evil." Evil was the word he used. When he told me the story, he shook, and my father is not afraid of anything. After a week, he realized that the painting was drawing the family in, and he went into the room, picked it up, and carried it to the garbage bin. If he thought that the ladder and the pentagram fought him, it was nothing compared to the portrait. Every step he took, the screaming inside his head grew louder, and he had never wanted anything more than to turn around, go back inside the house, and put the painting back where it belonged. The screaming didn't stop when he used every bit of his strength to lift the portrait up and put it in the bin. The screaming didn't stop when he put the lid on and went back inside. For the next 4 days, until the garbage was picked up, the whole family walked around on pins and needles. Each one of them wanted to go back to the garbage and rescue the painting. They were each convinced that something bad would happen if it was thrown away. As the days passed, this conviction grew stronger. It was the hardest thing in the world to resist. None of them slept properly. They all had nightmares. On the morning when the garbage truck finally came, my father was awake in bed. He heard it coming. He felt abject terror at the thought of losing the painting. He actually shook. He actually gripped the mattress to stop himself from getting up, rescuing the painting from the garbage, and bringing it back inside. The screaming in his head got worse and worse as the truck came closer. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, he told me, to lie still as the garbage men took the painting away. After that, the house was slightly better. It still hated. I still had nightmares. It still creaked at night, the unfastened timbers shifting against each other, cursing their very existence. My eldest brother turned to my father one day and told him that Eddie was unhappy, angry that we were there, angry that the pentagram had been painted over, the painting and rubbish taken away, angry that my father was hammering nails into every surface possible. Who was Eddie? He was a man. He wore a flannel shirt. This was his house, and he was angry that we were there. He was angry because the more nails put in, the more drywall that was ripped out, and the more paint that was splashed around, the house became less and less his. He was angry, and my brother could see him in his flannel shirt, just out of the corner of his eye. I never met Eddie the way my brother did, but he was certainly there. I was always afraid. I covered my windows for fear that something would look in. I made childish altars in self-defense. We never knew who Eddie was, or where he had come from, but we were certain that it had something to do with the pentagram and the portrait of the man. And while he thought that the entire house was his, it was the back bedroom especially that he wanted. As the years passed, we ripped out much of the house and replaced it. Eddie's power faded and faded until finally one day, someone walked in and said, "Oh, this is such a nice, friendly house." One thing is certain, Eddie was there. Eddie hated us. Eddie thought the house was his, and he fought us every step of the way. My parents had hoped that taking down the pentagram and throwing away the painting would get rid of him, but it only weakened him slightly. These days, I have a thoroughly scientific and skeptical approach to everything, but I do know that houses can have a soul, and they can hate. I don't know what would have happened to us if my father hadn't been strong enough to remove the objects. I don't want to know. I do know that I spent my childhood in fear of things I could not name, certain that I was always watched and loathed.
I know most people won't believe me, but I will tell my story anyway. It's true, and I am just writing it off the top of my head right now. Ever since my mum died of thyroid cancer when I was 9, I have been having trouble sleeping. Not just normal trouble like insomnia or plain restlessness. This is where I am afraid I will lose most people. I fall asleep fine, but more often than not, I will wake up in the middle of the night. I will be in a cold sweat, my body will be shaking or twitching, but I won't be able to move. I can hardly even close my eyelids. I never get used to it and struggle every time. It gets weirder. As I am stuck on my back, paralyzed, I start to see movement out of the corner of my eye. I see a figure moving closer and closer to me until its face is only a couple of inches away from my face. This is where I start to freak out. My heart starts beating extremely fast, my eyes start to tear up, and I have trouble breathing. It feels as if the figure is resting on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I never actually get a good look at its face, as it is always in my peripheral vision. There is never more than one, and from what I can tell, it always seems to be the same thing. This usually lasts about 5 minutes before I pass out again. It has been happening for about 15 years now. Not every night, but at least a couple of times a week. I know this sounds hard to believe. Every night before I go to sleep, I pray that I can just make it through the night without having to experience this again, but it doesn't seem to make a difference.
This is some real life OC. I used to work at an old movie theater 3 years ago. The place was built in the early 50s and needed a lot of repair work done to it. I had gotten the job in the beginning of May for the summer vacation, and I knew it was an easy place to work. I worked for roughly a month until the entire staff found out the building was structurally unsafe and wasn't creating enough revenue, so the theater had to close down. I was bummed out along with the rest of the staff to find out that our jobs would be ending. The theater was scheduled to be closed in early September, which gave me enough time to save enough money for the school year. But this news of the theater's closing came with some supernatural repercussions. Employees of the cinema had long reported strangely misplaced reels of film or movie seats that had moved up and down on their own. During late-night cleanup, after the last movies had been let out, lights would flicker, groaning noises were sometimes heard, and soft footsteps could sometimes be heard following employees. I didn't believe any of this bullshit. I thought it was mainly a way to scare me and make me jumpy. I didn't believe it until I had a first-hand encounter with the paranormal. I was cleaning up a small theater late one night in July when I bent down to pick up some discarded popcorn. As I stood up, I saw a shadow move at the bottom of the theater near the movie screen. I thought, A, this is a person trying to sneak in, or B, a coworker fucking with me. I walked down to investigate the movement. As soon as I had walked down the aisle to the bottom, the lights went out in the theater and the sound of footsteps came slowly down the aisle. Like all douchebag movie ushers, I had a flashlight and shined it in the general direction of the footsteps. Nothing. A seat in the far side of the theater started moving up and down of its own accord, and I fled. Well, needless to say, I wasn't going in that theater again. I told my coworkers about my experience, and others affirmed that they had been subject to a similar experience. I continued to work there, and a few weeks passed. More stories of this paranormal activity were passed around as the weeks went on. It was deemed by the manager as a stupid paranoia, until one morning when opening the theater, the manager discovered that all 12 reels of movies had been ripped off their racks and strewn about the projection booths. After this, the manager agreed that something was certainly awry. My second experience with the ghosts was during the morning when opening the theater. It was my job to change the letters on the sign out front. I went up to the projection booths, which was a long, dimly lit, eerie hallway that housed the projection machines, to retrieve the letters. I got the appropriate letters to spell out Wedding Crashers and headed up the ladder to the roof of the theater. I changed the sign and came back down to put away the old letters. There were now words written with the letters on the floor. Why now? There was no one else in the building besides me and the manager. I instantly ran to get her in her office on the first floor. She was reluctant to go see it, but when we came to the letters, they had all been pulled to the floor and mixed up. During the final weeks that the cinema was open, I worked more and more. On the second to last day before the cinema closed, the manager decided to have a staff party to thank us and whatnot. We were going to watch The 40-Year-Old Virgin after closing the theater. All the employees got together and sat in the theater that night. During the movie broke 4 times and the lights turned on and off occasionally. I worked the next day and then left for good. I went to college the next year, and when I came back the next summer, I noticed that the cinema had been demolished. All the structure was taken, and all that was left was a large concrete slab where the cinema once stood. I decided to stop and walk around a place that I really enjoyed working for. I was about ready to leave when I spotted something. I walked over and realized that the demolition people had left some of the movie letters. As I walked over to take them home, I noticed that they formed coherent words. I'm here. So believe me or not, this actually happened. After 2 years, the land has still yet to be redeveloped.
You may remember the Mason thread we had recently. In it, I posted a quip about an odd Masonic hall in my town. Someone mentioned that I should write a story about it, so I did one better. I went exploring, and this is what happened. I live in a small town in upstate New York. No more than 600 people sleep here, and less call it home. I moved up from Brooklyn about 5 years ago, and immediately fell in love with its charm, its closeness, and as is the subject of this tale, its mystery. One day not long ago, as I was walking down the town's only avenue past a used bookshop that only sells books you've never heard of, and across from the building that doesn't seem to know what it wants to be, sandwich shop, art gallery, grocery, all in recent memory, I tripped on one of many uneven sidewalk slabs. As I picked my possessions and myself up off the biting fall cement, I noticed a large sign above an abandoned building I must pass daily, a building that was not out of the ordinary to me at all. The sign was what gave me that start of unfamiliarity, as it declared the building a Masonic lodge in its old, carefully flowering print. It was the first time I had seen the sign on this building in my then 4 years of inhabitance. It's probably just an old sign someone found and hung up there, I thought to myself. But even as that thought resounded around my head, I could tell that it wasn't quite right. No, there was another motive behind the appearance of that sign, and now I was determined to find it. I went about asking locals, those who had lived there longer than my years, that is, if they had ever seen the sign before, who owned the building, had they ever seen anyone go into it, that sort of thing. To my surprise, not one of the questioned had noticed the sign, and when I pointed it out to them, they were visibly startled at its unannounced appearance. You see, in this town, no one does anything without someone else hearing about it. Something as large as a building-wide sign going up would have been remembered by at least one person, but no one could recall it. As for my inquiries of ownership and use of the building, no one knew who held the deed, and no one had ever seen anyone go into or out of it. I decided that I would have to investigate myself. Obviously, the best way of doing this would be to break into the building at night, armed with only a flashlight and a tape recorder, to document my findings. In hindsight, I'm not exactly sure why I chose the night to explore this old, abandoned, would-be Masonic lodge. Perhaps the writing of a story was sneaking into my subconscious. So on a Saturday night, I approached the mysterious building, and upon trying the door, found it unlocked. My flashlight showed me nothing of interest on the ground floor. All that decorated the bare rooms was dust and decay. Then my light shone upon the staircase, and I knew that my investigation had only just begun. Upon mounting the second floor, I knew immediately that there was something here. Maybe not an intelligence, but a distinct presence of something strange hung from the walls and dripped from the ceiling. At first I thought that the second floor was just as void of furnishings as the first, and that's when my flashlight shone into the room. I instantly thought that I had somehow switched on a light. Hundreds of splinters of brightness shone all around me. Half a second later, I realized I was staring into a room of mirrors. The walls were covered in paneled mirrors. The ceiling was plastered with decorative glass and reflective metal. I don't know a lot about Masonic lodges, but I had the distinct feeling that this was a unique feature. Just as I was going to inspect my sudden doppelgangers, I noticed something distinctly odd in my leftmost reflection. Everything looked normal about me at first, but I knew something was off. Only when I had shone my flashlight directly at my reflection could I realize that the illusion I was seeing was nothing of the sort. My reflection had no eyes, just pits of black gazed back at me from that mirror. I felt my heart skip a beat, and then my brain immediately contained it with reason. It must be a shadow from the flashlight, insisted my logic. But I knew that no shadow would be so deep. No shadow would be so still in the light from my shaking arm. And as soon as that epiphany was reached, this startling event repeated itself. Now the reflection to my right was also missing its eyes just as irrefutably. It was at that point that I completely lost the resolve that I had worked so hard to keep. Turning away from those frightening reflections, I ran quickly to the room I came from. Turning from door to door, I scrambled for the stairs. At one point, I was sure that the halls had become a maze, that I would never find the stairs. Just as this adrenaline-fueled insanity crossed my mind, I almost catapulted myself down the flight I had been looking for what now seemed like hours. Upon reaching the street, I looked at my watch. 5 minutes had passed since I entered the lodge. Just as I turned away from swinging the door shut, the final shock of my night bit into my retinas, as if the lodge would not let me leave without suffering a heart attack first. As I rotated away from that place, I saw 2 distinct pairs of eyes staring back at me from the door frame. Neither my feet nor my heart stopped running until I was safely locked up at home, and it took me hours to fall asleep that night. Every time I would start to drift off, I would see those eyes looking back at me from a corner, from the ceiling, from the floor. The next day, my neighbor asked me if I had ever found the answers I was looking for about the lodge. "No, but I think my curiosity is good for now," I responded lamely. By next week, the sign was again gone. To this date, I never walk by that building unless I have to. Far away from the unknown bookstore, far away from the confused storefront, that is where I want to be.
Army here. I'm in a barracks by the Army hospital in Fort Bliss. Supposedly 10 or so years ago, a soldier OD'd on painkillers and died. All throughout the night, you'll hear things crashing or furniture being dragged from what sounds like the next room over. I asked my neighbor one day, prior to knowledge of the barracks history, why she was moving her furniture in the middle of the night. She said it wasn't her and in fact thought it was me. The guy on the other side of my room said he hears the noises plain as day as well, and also thought it was me. Basically, the sounds always come from the room next to your own, annoying more than anything. When I was in the Army and stationed at Fort Hood, sometimes at night you could hear footsteps on the roof. At first glance, that would not seem particularly paranormal since the roof was pretty flat and there was a fire escape ladder to it, but the ladder had a cover that was always locked to keep people off of there. One could climb past it in theory, and I'm sure some people did at some point, but the way and time you'd hear these steps were what made this stick in my mind. There was this one chick in the unit that also lived on the 3rd top floor, who mentioned hearing it frequently, but I rarely did and usually wrote it off as some jackass up there drinking or something. Anyway, one time on a Friday night and Saturday morning, my friends and I had gotten back pretty late, like 1 a.m. or so. I stayed up a bit after that and was playing Counter-Strike. This was in the pre-team days, version 1.1 when I was an addict, when there was suddenly this really loud bang that sounded like it was from the room next door. I stopped playing and listened, but it was totally silent next door. It sounded like someone had a baseball bat and slammed it into plywood as hard as they could. Since I didn't hear anything else, I continued playing, then again, bang. This time I went outside and saw the people across the hall out of their rooms already, looking wide-eyed. The guy who lived next door came out and we looked at each other, and while we were all standing out there on the 3rd floor landing, there was another louder bang almost directly above us that made us jump. Then, some really, really slow footsteps that started pacing above us. After a moment, the footsteps stopped, and one of the guys living up there pointed out that there were 2 roof access ladders on the outside of the building and 2 in the atrium. One of the outside ones was visible from the landing and one of the inside ones was on our landing, and neither he nor his roommate had seen anyone in the past half hour they'd been out there smoking. The other interior ladder was directly across from our landing in view, which meant the only way someone could have gotten on the roof was to use the ladder, which was directly next to the day room, where the CQ, charge of quarters, was. Someone started to say something then, but I don't remember what, because there was suddenly a loud banging, like several people were actively kicking around 3 or 4 of those metal garbage cans. By the time it stopped, the people also on the 3rd floor but on the other side of the atrium were out of their rooms and asking us what the fuck was going on. About then, my roommate had gotten back and someone went to tell the CQ that someone was dicking around on the roof. The CQ had sent his runner to wait by the other ladder to make sure no one got down, and sent for the ladder key from the staff duty. By now, there was a smallish crowd of people from the 2nd and 3rd floor out of their rooms at 3 in the morning, wondering what was going on. When they got the key, they sent 2 people onto the roof with flashlights, and there was nothing up there. No people, no objects that could be thrown around to make that kind of noise. Nothing. Keep in mind that this was one of the older barracks that did not have those AC units on the roof, or anything else. Nothing to hide behind or throw around. Nothing. As far as I know, there were no incidents of people being hurt or killed up there. Stories like that would certainly have been well known, or anything like that happening in that building. I did know some guy who backflipped off of the second-story landing on a bet, landed with no injury, and someone in another building that fell from the second-story landing while drunk, landed with minor injuries, but none of the ghost-inducing stuff.
Well, here's one. About 4 years ago, my grandmother was visiting the family. As I'm asleep one night, I'm suddenly woken up by someone standing over me. Still rather asleep, I wonder who it could be. So I just barely open my eyes to see an outline of a person who I believed was my grandmother, who may have gone into my room trying to get into the bathroom it's next to. It's blurry, though. I mean, my eye was just barely open, so nobody would notice me looking, so I'm not sure. A recent rash of burglaries has made me paranoid, though, so I start stretching my limbs to get my circulation up, in case this was a less than well-meaning intruder. I finally get the blood flowing, and I ask, "Grandma?" to the figure. Then, with a jerking motion, I swear it almost looked like a poorly streamed video, it starts to turn away. I open my eyes wide enough to see. The blur goes away from everything except the figure, who continues away from me and through a solid wall. Barracks, not shat. Too wide-eyed with terror, I almost didn't blink till sunrise 2 hours from that time. One day, about an hour before work, I was getting ready when I heard the staircase creaking, as if someone was coming up. I was a bit surprised because I didn't hear any cars arrive or the doors open, but this has happened many times before, so I was wondering who it was rather than what was going on. Suddenly, clear as day, I could see a white male with black hair walking by, wearing a black shirt and forest camo pants. My room is down the hall from the stairs, but has a perfect view of the hallway leading into the master bedroom. Suspecting the worst, I picked up a baseball bat and my phone and ran after this guy. I followed him into the master bedroom, but nobody was there, so I headed into the master bathroom. Still, nobody. I checked every nook and cranny of this room, as there is no way out except by going past me again, and I didn't want someone to hide and get away just because I didn't look carefully enough. I just want to stress that there was absolutely no way out of that room, and that this wasn't a caught in the edge of my vision person. I was looking full on into the hallway for someone to come up the stairs, so I got a good look at him.
Most revolve around where my father lives, where I grew up. When we were checking out the house, the realtor told us the home was in a fire some years ago. We didn't think much of it, but it wasn't until recently that I discovered the truth behind it. The house had 3 rooms and a bathroom on the second floor, a big attic, basically another room, and a tiny hole in the attic to an upper area, small attic I suppose, and a basement, typical suburban home. My first room was the middle room on the second floor, which was 1 room away from the bathroom at the end of the staircase. I had a large oak bed, which at the time I was too young to consider how heavy the bed was. Well, as I laid down, the bed started to shake. I assumed it was my brother, so I said, "Chris, stop." It stopped for a second, only to continue again. So I said louder, "Chris, stop." Well, it did it again. So I screamed for him to stop, and as I screamed, I heard him yell back from the shower, "What?" I ran out as fast as possible. He was my only sibling at the time, so it wasn't possible for it to be anyone else. We used the attic as our playroom, and I used to sell sports cards in school. I know, stupid. So I would use the table to organize them. One afternoon, I was up there and the dresser shook similar to my bed before. I heard a wicked voice cackling, and as I turned my head, I saw a little boy run down the stairs. I ran down as well. On many occasions, I would see the little boy chasing a dog in the kitchen, but for some reason was never scared of it. Hard to explain, but he didn't bring that usual feeling of dread like other spirits tend to. After my brother moved out, I took the room near the bathroom which faced the backyard. It was in this room that I became so paranoid I couldn't fall asleep unless someone was with me. I saw black figures in the corner of the room almost constantly, and I don't mean in the corner of my eye. I mean I could stare at them. Thinking I was just overreacting, I decided to get the courage to fall asleep, but I couldn't after laying there for what seemed to be 10 minutes. I opened my eyes to see one looming over at me, just tilted forward in my direction. I blinked and it was gone. In that same room, the closet would open and close by itself. It wasn't possibly wind because my father was extremely cheap and would saran wrap the windows to keep heat in during the winter. So to remedy this, he placed a plank of wood between the wall and the door so it would only close by force. Well, it continued to happen. Also not sure if it's related, but insects were a common occurrence in this room and only this room. At one point infested by stink bugs. And no, I'm not gross, haha. Another time my father and I both heard hammering from the other side of the wall on the second floor at around 2 a.m. Later that day I went to visit my neighbors. A joined house is half a double or whatever it's called, and before I brought up the hammering they asked me why was I hammering last night. Another common thing was objects being moved from room to room, basically mischievous behavior. And before moving out our family had a huge argument, and while we were in the kitchen arguing, all of the floodlights in the basement fell to the floor and shattered everywhere. No one was down there, and no one was stomping or anything. During my time in the house, my father had another child with another woman. Well, my little brother and I lost contact for a couple of years, and recently started hanging out again. He still lives there, and I never had a chance to tell him my experiences there. He's in the same room I had at the end. I was staying over for the night, but I was up until around 5:30 a.m. playing WoW. I know, and yes, I brought my computer over because I'm a nerd. Well, he was up too, which I thought was odd. He started tearing up a little, trying to tell me why he can't sleep. He had the exact same problems as me, but he also said he would feel hands touching his legs and whatnot. I freaked out a little, but was inspired to tell him my stories as well. He didn't go to sleep that night after I reassured him that what he had experienced was real, haha. Well, that day I slept in that room since he didn't want to, and yeah, the closet was already open, but I didn't experience anything until I turned off the TV. You know that initial creaking sound a heavy TV makes when you first start to move it? Yeah, every time I turned away from the TV. I like sleeping facing walls, more than likely because of what happened growing up. I heard the TV shift. Literally, every time. So I got up smirking, asking it to leave me be. And as I did, a picture fell from the closet, pushing the door open. It was some creepy picture of a little boy with no eyes. Yeah, that was enough for me, so I joined my brother downstairs. That day we decided to research the house and found something in the newspaper regarding its history. It turns out that the fire it was in had a grim reason as well. There were 2 kids who hid in the very closet we had problems with. They burned alive. The parents ran out of the house, and realizing what they did to their kids, they offed themselves. If you want to look up the house, it is 1328 Stanley Avenue, Fountain Hill, Pennsylvania, 18015. I'll look around again to get some proof, but I don't remember where we found the history. More recently, my grandma, who is dead, visited my apartment. She always wore crazy hooker red lipstick and drank tea. It was her thing. Well, I never leave dishes in the sink before bed. One night I woke up to dishes clanking. I went to the kitchen and on the side of the sink was a teacup with red lipstick on it. And finally, the scariest experience I've had. It was with a young girl named Sarah, whose face was cut similar to the Black Dahlia. She would whisper my name in my ear at night. I never turned around as I was too busy losing it. One night, I went to brush my teeth and I saw her behind me. And most electronic devices would go out or create white noise when she was present. My mother didn't believe me, so she stayed the night here, and she woke up around 4:30 a.m., screaming and crying. She told me a little girl was jumping on the bed. I swear, anon, I got the courage to try to talk to her, and she said her name was Sarah, and I asked her to please leave me be. I apologized for her not having a childhood and assumed it was the reason she wanted attention. That was it.
This is a story I've read. It's Japanese. There was this taxi driver, right? He was driving back to his pool one evening. It was a mountainous area, and there's a tunnel he had to go through. The tunnel is supposed to be haunted. That's why the driver gets tensed up. Just as the tunnel ends, he gets surprised by a flash of blue and white across the street. He turned the wheel a hard right, but it was too late. There was a high school girl flying towards the ravine. and her pink bike falling is the last the taxi driver saw of her. Panicked, he quickly drove off. Nobody saw me, it didn't happen. And he arrived at his pool, shaken, and he got a week off. He kept his mouth shut about the accident and fabricated a story about seeing a ghost. Then as time goes by, he gradually forgets the incident, until one day when a lady asked for a ride. The route had to go through the haunted tunnel. While in the tunnel, the woman suddenly said to the driver, "Excuse me, sir, do you happen to know something about an accident in the area?" The taxi driver gasped silently. No way anyone should know about his incident. "No, ma'am, I don't think I remember such an event. But there definitely is an accident here. They say a high school girl had been killed in a hit-and-run by a taxi." The taxi driver shivers. Who the heck is this, and how does she know about the incident? He gingerly peeked through his rearview mirror. He was aghast. The woman is gone. But her disembodied voice remained behind to say, "And look, it's even the same time she died." The taxi driver quickly looked at his watch. It is exactly as the disembodied voice said. Suddenly, the taxi exited the tunnel, and there in the middle of the road, the pink bike. The taxi driver panicked and hit a hard right. The safety fence gave way, and the whole taxicab fell into the ravine. Then back on the roadside, aside the broken safety fence, all that's left is the girl's pink bike.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.